I'm Richard Moore. This is The Pathfinder, where you'll find conversations with faculty, administrators, policymakers, researchers, really anyone making a difference in the lives of students at community colleges. It's a partnership between the Texas Success Center and the Texas Community College Teachers Association. Today, Jenna Cullinane Hege joins us to talk about the overarching policy goals for higher education in Texas. The agenda is called 60x30TX and aims to ensure 60% of adult Texans have some sort of higher education credential by 2030. Jenna is the Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Strategic Planning and Funding at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, and it's her job to connect that agency's work to current data on students and institutions across the state, and to make sure the data the Coordinating Board has is widely shared with as many education stakeholders as possible. It's a big job, especially in these times of rapid change, so we sat down to find out what she's working on and what educators need to do to help meet the ambitious goals of 60x30TX. Here's Jenna Cullinane Hege. Jenna Cullinane, thanks for being with us on the podcast.
Well, I have to stop you right there. Sorry. My new moniker is Jenna Cullinane Hege.
Thank you. Yes, and congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
So you have another new transition in life. You're at the coordinating board now.
That's true. Another major transition. Yeah, I've been there just over a year.
Mm-hmm. And how do you like that so far?
It's very exciting. I think there is a whole new world. I was with the Dana Center for a long time, 8 years almost, and I'm very passionate about student success and developmental education kind of getting off to a strong start. It's kind of a popular way to say things these days, but it's been exciting to learn about many different areas of higher education policy, including some about funding and really connecting to our state strategic plan and trying to work broadly on some of those goals.
Well, in fact, why don't we start out? Let's talk about the Dana Center first,
Sure.
just to kind of take this chronologically. And even before that, how did you get into this work? I mean, I've been talking with a lot of people about higher education issues, and some of them knew when they were 5 years old that they wanted to do this. Others kind of came to it later. What was your path to this?
So my path probably started back in high school. I was a Senate page in Washington, D.C. My junior year in high school, and so spent time in the Senate chambers and listening to policy debate at the highest levels, and was sort of bit by the policy bug in a big way, and knew that I was very interested in issues of social justice and opportunity for all people. And so that is what motivated me. I later went to Berkeley and had a couple of very influential professors, one in particular in an education course that I took that really had us confront the realities of race and inequality in education. And part of that course was to spend time in inner city Oakland communities and volunteering, and I spent a lot of time doing that, taking the bus from Berkeley into the inner city, being at the YMCA, at a middle school there, and was really committed at that time to education as a particular policy pursuit. And then after college, went to the Institute for Higher Education Policy in D.C., and I will admit that I was looking for any job anywhere, that first kind of post-college opportunity, and the Institute for Higher Education Policy really, a little bit of serendipity pushed me more towards higher education, but really found a great home there. I was working closely with Jamie Marisotis, who was the president at that time, and was working a lot with minority-serving institutions and focusing on kind of the broad social outcomes of higher education related to health, civic participation, kind of family opportunity. So those were some of the things that got me started and got me excited about higher education.
Those sound like really formative experiences for you. And it seems like higher education and education broadly has been always seen as the antidote to inequality and the way out of cycles that we're not happy with. There seems to have been a trend in the past number of years where higher education seems to be reinforcing some of those class structures, largely driven around the cost to the individual student for their education. How do you see that playing out now? Is that getting better or worse? Are you seeing things that seem to be ameliorating some of that?
So, there are encouraging and discouraging signs, I think, on both sides of that. From an encouraging standpoint, if you look at students who are economically disadvantaged, and let's just say you look at their 8th grade cohort success through higher education, they trail dramatically students who are not economically disadvantaged, but they've made progress over time. So, we're moving in the right direction, but we haven't totally addressed the achievement gaps that exist. They're very persistent, and they require kind of continued and renewed effort because we haven't made as much progress there as we need to. On the other hand, I think when we think about opening up higher education, more and more students, this is their first generation, they're a first generation student. And I think there's a belief that we would get to a point where there would be fewer first generation students, but that's really not the case. Our demography is such that we can't just go back to students who have experiences or with their family in terms of higher education. So, demography is going to continue to force us to confront these really hard issues and really serve our students better who have not previously had higher education experiences.
Well, and I think part of it too is this notion that, if you grow up in a wealthy family, then when you go to college, you'll go to an Ivy League school or Stanford or a school like that. If your parents aren't wealthy but they're well off, then they might go to a flagship public university, and then and community colleges are sort of the catch-all for everybody else. And what do you think of this idea? Either should we disrupt that so that the school you go to isn't so correlated to your family's income, and how much of it of the solution needs to be that a community college needs to have every bit the quality experience that a major university would have?
Tricky question. Good question. I would say, correlation between a family income and education is something that exists, but I would love to see be less correlated. Really, you hope that opportunity is based on effort and, commitment to education and desire for where people want to go in their future. And so I would hope that would be completely open regardless of where you come from in terms of a financial background. There are realities to the cost of higher education, and we're thinking a lot about student debt. The thing I would say, if I had to think of one thing that kind of keeps me up at night, is student debt amongst students who are unsuccessful. And I think that's a really important issue in higher education, that the students who have the highest level of default, who have the most significant problems with student debt, have only between kind of $2,000 and $5,000 in terms of a level of debt, but they're unsuccessful students. And so how do we make good on the promise of higher education, whether it's 2-year, 4-year, Ivy League not, that students are making an investment, and so we have a responsibility to help students reach their goals so that they haven't taken out debt and kind of suffered the consequences of that debt without the benefits of actually completing a credential, whether that be a certificate, license degree, etc.
It does seem like the biggest piece of this, and the one that seems hardest to talk about, is the fact that legislatures nationally are getting out of the business of funding higher education to the extent that we did in the past. If the percentage of the cost of higher education continue to remain the same that the legislature was covering, that would solve most of this problem. But legislatures don't seem interested in doing that so much, or don't feel capable of doing it. How does this look at a policy level? I mean, as we're dealing with these issues, some of it needs to be what can the student do. Some of it needs to be what can the institution do. Right. The biggest piece of it, and the part that's hardest to talk about, it seems, is what the legislature can do about it.
Well, it does feel least in my control. I'll say that, and not that any of those in particular are. But yeah, I think we've seen a trend nationally in states decreasing their level of funding, and I think there is two kind of philosophical beliefs that pair with that. And one is that People are seeing higher education more and more as a private good instead of a public good, and that has kind of shifted over time. If you think of things like the GI Bill, that is a big public investment saying that we are all going to reap the benefits of a more educated populace, whether it be in terms of taxes or reduced incarceration or reduced other public services. But over time, surveys show us that people feel like it more is a private good for an individual to go get a particular kind of job. So that's one thing. And then the other is that higher education 30, 40 years ago was perceived as kind of a nonpartisan issue, and has increasingly become kind of more partisan. So I think those are some things that kind of contribute to some of the decreases that we've seen over time. And of course, recessions and other natural disasters, compete with some of those priorities. But like you said, I think the state is one piece of the puzzle, and that's an area where we need to continue to advocate for the role a strong higher education system plays in the state, and what it means for our future workforce and for kind of the health of our collective community. But like you said, institutions and students also play a role. So there are things that I think we want to keep all of the tools in the toolbox here about what we can do to help keep college affordable, whether that's efficiencies on the institutional side and or helping to support students to make savvy choices about their consumption in higher education.
Well, Ed, if you're a practitioner in this space, an administrator or a faculty member, someone on a college campus, someone working in financial aid or whatever, that's where you can really have a direct impact on individual students and large groupings of students at many of our schools. What did you find at the Dana Center? I mean, you did a lot of work there on what was making a difference, and y'all, my observation was that y'all saw mathematics as a key element in all this and drove the outcomes for much of what students wound up achieving. What did you find that seemed to make the most difference?
So at the Dana Center, we were working on the success of students in developmental education, the early gateway courses focusing particularly on mathematics, and we were very focused on the lack of success among students who came in at various levels of developmental education, and felt like there was a real disconnect between the experiences students were having in their developmental coursework and what they really hoped their program of study or their future lives were going to be about. And so, the big push was to think about what is the right content for people and help them connect that to their program of study. So whether that be statistics or quantitative reasoning, or if you're really on a pathway to a STEM degree, what are the mathematical skills you need to kind of move successfully through calculus and beyond? So from a student perspective, it was wanting to make sure that we're surfacing what are student goals first, and then thinking about the content and learning experiences that would support that. Also thinking about how to move students much more quickly, and this kind of goes to the student debt issue, that you don't want students spending a lot of their financial aid capacity, their personal resources, taking courses that ultimately are not going to count towards their certificate or degree. So wanting to move students much more quickly as possible into a credit-bearing course and kind of on with their lives and programs. So those were some of the...
And y'all really approached this in a thoroughgoing way. It wasn't just a targeted intervention. Let's try this one thing different.
Sure.
You're really looking at the whole ecosystem that's happening.
Yes, absolutely.
So you're looking at policy, you're looking at curriculum, and kind of everything in between.
Right.
How did you see that from sort of that global perspective, and see how those elements work together?
So I work specifically on the policy side of things, and very quickly it's important to be thinking about transfer, and ended up doing much more work than we could have imagined when we first started this, that as soon as you start talking about gateway courses and programs of study, those need to be aligned across sectors. So we launched work called the Transfer Champions work, where we were looking to engage universities to work with community colleges. And at first, faculty member at a particular university might say, that developmental education problem, that's not my problem. I don't really understand sort of how these things connect, but really needing to think bigger about, it's not just the experience the student is having in a particular semester, but you're putting them on this larger pathway. And then this was a little bit on the front edge of the guided pathways work, and then very quickly found a home for some of this math pathways work in the larger guided pathways efforts that are now out and about. Other issues related to placement and advising, I think all, quickly came into play when we think about broad systems and how to make these kinds of changes.
Yeah, that's something we saw a lot with that. I think our members' experience of what y'all were working on has been, they started having conversations that they didn't have before. You're talking different disciplines are having conversations about what's going on in their classes, and they're thinking about the students' experience coming into school and where they might be confused or get sidetracked. So it's kind of causing those practitioners to see their role differently and the way they interface with different people at the college. How did y'all, or how has the Dana Center developed that kind of culture where they were talking? I mean, did you just show up on campus and say, let's do this? I mean, this is more like changing a culture than selling a product. So
right.
How do you prompt that?
Right. Well, I've been thinking a lot about that, especially in my new role at the coordinating board, is when and how to partner, and how do you get the coalition of the willing to come together to have a common purpose and some agreement about common strategy to move a goal forward. So I would say social capital is a really big piece of it, and I think it's getting to know people, and sometimes that's lunch or coffee, shared meetings. It's coming to understand where are common values, and really, I mean, this might sound a little bit trite, but it really is about student success at its core. And if you can help people figure out how they might fit into a complex change when they feel like, oh, I only have this one little piece of the puzzle, and I couldn't possibly make this big change. But you can give people hope and give people agency if you give them some permission to say, well, we're going to coordinate these things. We're going to bring all these pieces together, and we can make this big shift. You don't have to do it alone. So each of these started with, a friendly person who wanted to kind of deal with mathematics or developmental issues, maybe, UT system, or then at TAC, and then, new friends in the UNT system. And so each of these kind of built and I think gave us some cachet and credibility, especially among other players. And we really worked hard, I'm really proud of this, to try and work with and through the associations that exist. I think whatever kind of change you're looking to move, if it is affecting many different role types, working through the Association for Institutional Researchers, for the Association for Instructional Administrators, for the mathematics chairs, those are really important because you want to get everyone at least informed, and then hopefully some agreement again on those broad goals and strategies, and figuring out how do we articulate this across many institutions, many roles.
That was something I heard a lot of our members talking about, that I know what would need to happen, but I can't convene a meeting of my dean and my vice president of instruction and the principal at the high school.
Right.
But I know that's what it would take to make this happen. And so y'all were able to prompt those sorts of gatherings. But then beyond that, well, let's talk a little bit about those connections across institutions where you're dealing with ISDs and with like UNT, with university partners. What did those look like? I mean, as you got the community colleges having those conversations, what did you see happening? I mean, were there roadblocks that seemed to come up a lot, or kind of breakthroughs that seemed successful?
So I could speak more to the 2-year, 4-year conversations. I think what was helpful, first of all, getting people in a room and having some breakfast and some coffee never hurts. But I think people, initially when we brought people together, it might be some math faculty, might be an administrator of some kind. I don't think people initially knew, why am I here? What is my piece? And so I think we typically started with some data, and I'm a data nerd. I love data, and it always is a safe place for me to start and say, let's have some grounding in what does it look like in terms of course taking, in terms of success, in terms of transfer patterns. Texas has an amazing wealth of public data out there, and that was always a good way to start. And we really tried to be conscious of not being punitive or embarrassing people with data. It was really, let's look at this collection of data, or making sure that there was a level of comfort with that data discussion. But typically people were ready to say, this is where we are. We need to start from somewhere. Let's have an honest conversation. And then you could facilitate experiences or conversations about particular experiences, and we would try and drive, we knew the big concerns that this isn't going to transfer, or what about education majors, or what about, so there were some of those common hot button things that we tried to just create space for those issues to come out, and hopefully have folks to be able to address some of those things together.
And you found data, access to data seemed to be part of what made those conversations happen and move forward, because you could share the facts.
Absolutely. So we talked a lot about perceived challenges. So there are absolutely real barriers to moving system change work. But I was impressed at how many I would categorize as perceived barriers that were perceived as much larger than they really were. And an example I would give of this is, well, University X is never going to accept that, or they don't want to play. And when you look at the data, you really only send 3 students there a year. So you've got 100 students going over here. So, let's kind of prioritize and focus on a place where you'd get a lot of payoff for that kind of partnership. Another is really looking at patterns of which programs of study people are in. And I think that data is available, but we don't often look by program of study. So that's another lens of, I think people are familiar with their own kind of course success data, but looking more broadly at kind of collections of majors or programs was typically a new insight for folks.
Stick around for more of our interview with Jenna Cullinane Hege. But first, let's find out about some upcoming events for our community college folks in Texas. Next week, on November 6th, 7th, and 8th, the Success Center will be hosting its 3rd annual Pathways Institute in San Antonio. This program will give people at colleges that are implementing guided pathways an opportunity to work with their teams in focused programs, as well as connect with colleagues across the state and hear from researchers in the field. You can find out more on the TAC website at tacc.org. And be sure to make your plans to attend this year's TCCTA convention up in the Dallas area. This is the largest gathering of community college folks in Texas, and there will be lots of programs covering more than 50 disciplines, as well as teaching hacks and time to meet up with friends across the state to share your passion for teaching. So hold the date, the first weekend in March 2018, and visit the tccta.org website for all the program and travel information. Now, let's get back to the conversation. So you had many conversations with people on campuses and groupings of campuses, and now you're at the coordinating board. Talk a little bit about how those experiences inform your work, because you're dealing with large aggregates of data,
Sure.
a lot of information, you're connecting it directly with state policies. How do those conversations, those relationships, the experiences you had at the more local level inform what you're seeing now at the coordinating board?
Good question. So the first thing that jumps out is obviously developmental education and kind of gateway course success are very near and dear to my heart. I've spent a lot of time working on those, and we have new legislation that HB 2223 related to co-requisites. And so as we're trying to get a handle on, let's just say, data collection, what are we going to collect related to co-requisites? How do we help support people to be able to fulfill the objectives of that piece of legislation? It helps a lot to have a textured sense of the work on the ground. And so, one issue about would we look at math and reading, writing together or separately, and what does that look like? And we know that a lot of the innovation in developmental education really happens in one, it could be happening just on the math side and not on the reading, writing side, and vice versa. And so that was just something that came up this week to think about, that where does change really happen? And we talked about that the ownership, a lot of this change is actually in those disciplinary areas, not at every school, but there are kind of important differences across. So I wouldn't lump an institution into a single approach, because most places have many approaches, either by discipline or student characteristics and so forth. So that's one example.
So as you're doing your work at a state level, you're able to kind of distinguish the many different ways colleges metabolize policy,
right?
and so you're creating a variety of ways for them to interact with these directives, and based on those experiences you've had before,
right? And I think too, from a strategy level, a little bit larger grain size, we think about the goals of the state strategic plan, 60x30TX. There are some very ambitious goals there in terms of attainment levels, completion levels, student debt, and marketable skills. And, I think being able to access data to help us understand where we are now, what progress would look like, and maybe some of the underlying drivers that might be contributing to kind of current levels or progress, hopefully. I think data plays a really important role there, and helping to kind of convene, inform, inspire is a really important piece of this. And you were involved in our Data Fellows work recently, which is one strategy that I'm really working hard to make sure that our data doesn't sit on a shelf or in a website where nobody knows where it is or how to use it. And so this is one effort.
Well, that was actually something I wanted to ask you about. Describe the Data Fellows program, because it does seem the success of a lot of this work is going to come down to people having access to the data, knowing they have the access to the data, and then how to use it. So what is the Data Fellows program, and how are you approaching that?
The Data Fellows it's actually a reboot of something that was done several years ago, but with a new incarnation. So with the support of the Gates Foundation and the College for All Texans Foundation, we have some resources not only to build some data tools, and specifically we built a new website called 60by30tex.com, and it has all the goals.
What's that website again?
It's www.60by30tx.com.
Okay.
And it's a fantastic resource. We just got some user experience feedback back from a survey we did, and by and large, people are finding it to be very approachable, very user friendly. It's streamlined. It's really focused on just the goals and targets of the plan, nothing more, nothing less, kind of simple visual displays of the data. You can see it by statewide, you can see it by regional breakout, or by institution for many of the goals and targets. And so...
and who is that data for? I mean, who's the audience you built the website for?
Great question. So it is designed for a pretty broad audience, and that's something actually we're wrestling a little bit with right now based on some of the user feedback, is that we want this to be accessible to anyone in higher education. It's not complex analysis or detailed methodologies, very supposed to be straightforward, easily understandable metrics. So we want kind of a broad array of stakeholders in higher education to be able to use the data, but we also want it to be for the groups that are adjacent but necessary to meet our goals. So, folks in business and industry, folks in K-12, we're getting some feedback that, it might need a little more translation for people in additional sectors outside of higher education. So that's something we're kind of going to be working on enhancing, especially K-12 partners, and how should they be plugging in, and what do they need to know about the plan.
Is it for students? I mean, would students find value on it?
I think that it is, and this is my personal opinion, so I'll just asterisk this. I think that it is slightly less student-focused than some other resources. As part of the tri-agency work, I'm also working with OnCourse, for instance, or some of our Generation Techs, Gen Techs materials, which are very student-focused. I would say this is a little bit less so. It's really about kind of people who are going to play a role in kind of the planning and strategy around meeting state goals and objectives. So that's where I'm seeing the sweet spot a little bit more.
And how does the data help? I mean, what are you hoping it to advance?
So my big hypothesis through Data Fellows, which maybe I'll start there and then talk about the hypothesis, is that this reboot basically is bringing in, we've had 2 convenings so far, K-12 district leaders in the first group, and then a group of higher ed leaders that include association leaders, some philanthropic partners, and then folks like Richard and others who are nonprofit or association or intermediaries of other kinds in higher education that have broad networks that can help spread the word. And the idea with Data Fellows is to bring people in, train them on the higher education data resources, so 60x30TX.com, our revised accountability system, which we just rolled out this year, and then a few other kind of high leverage data sources. And this has a couple of purposes. So the big hypothesis, which I think we found to be true, is that by understanding deeply the data and what we're tracking, people will come to understand the plan better. And what happened is that once people had an opportunity to say, okay, what are we really tracking and measuring related to the 60 by 30 educated population goal? What are we really counting and measuring related to completion goal? They understood that those 2 things were different. That's a big source of confusion. Some people saying, oh, well, aren't these the same? We just want to graduate more people. So some of the subtleties kind of come out when we're saying, oh, no, this is actually a broad survey of the population, and we're looking at whether they were educated anywhere and whether they migrated, and kind of this broad view of the population versus what are institutions of higher education doing in terms of certificate and degree completion, kind of different ways of looking at that. So one is to make sure we're informing the field so that the kind of the nuances of the plan are understood. But then the second is that Data Fellows become ambassadors in some ways for us to reach that broader, the broader networks that you represent. So we've asked that every Data Fellow do at least one presentation following their training, so that you'll hopefully be talking to your TCCTA colleagues, and each of these organizations will then hit their networks. So the next 2 groups that are coming up, we're going to have some university representatives and then community college representatives in November, so look forward to some opportunities there. But then we also want that kind of ambassador level person around the state in institutions that can help us spread the word.
And I know we've talked about you coming to some of our future events and convening faculty in those discussions as well.
Yep. And I think the data, just another piece of this, is that it helps us figure out where we really need to focus, and there are 2 areas that I would highlight in this moment to say we have not yet seen much progress, and actually moving in the wrong direction on 2 areas, but progress in the other 9 areas. So, completion of African American students is something we really need to be focusing on, and the rate of students moving from high school into higher education directly kind of the following fall after they graduate is another kind of key indicator for us where we haven't seen the progress that we're hoping to see. So those are areas where I think we need to be partnering, communicating, doing extra research, additional initiatives to really make sure that we're making the progress we need to see. So
data is really being used as a key driver to make a compelling case for 60 by 30 TX. What is that case? I mean, when you're talking to people in policy discussions or people on a college campus, and you're saying this is why this matters, and this is why the state is focusing on this as that's kind of the organizing principle for higher education policy. How do you present that case?
So I present that case as one is making higher education, the promise of higher education, real in terms of not just access but completion for students, and with an important focus on subpopulations that are large and have not been as successful as other populations in the state. So around completion in particular, Hispanic students, African American students, male students, and economically disadvantaged students. I think, I came to the coordinating board after the plan was in place, but if I was to design it, I really feel like those 4 populations are absolutely critical to the future of Texas, both in terms of the economy and, again, kind of health of communities, I'll say that broadly, and wanting all parts of our population to be represented in higher education and have economic opportunities. So there is a heavy kind of Texas workforce rationale. I think we're seeing a lot of information now kind of post-recession that talks about how important it is to have some sort of post-secondary credential, whether that be a certificate, associate's degree, bachelor's, master's, etc. And also looking at kind of current wage information, what is the boost for folks who do have a credential of some kind. So wanting to make, I think, both for the good of the state, the kind of the future economy argument, and then also for individuals, that we want people to be making a livable wage in a sustainable kind of employment opportunity.
Now, this looks very different in different parts of the state, right? I mean, if just because of the starting point that if you're in Northeast Texas, it's going to be there's a different starting point than if you're in Central Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
How does the state break out regionally?
I'm so tickled you asked, because this is kind of the next big push for the strategic plan. We are very cognizant that regions are different, and when you look at patterns of enrollment into higher education or transfer patterns, the vast majority of those student flow patterns are within their region. It's about 80% of Texas students stay in their region to go to higher education, and particularly so in the two-year sector, right? So that's one aspect. The labor market and kind of differences among what are the needs, not only what kind of industry is there, but do you need a lot of certificates here? Do you need a lot of masters? What are kind of the employment opportunities for you in those different places? So knowing those differences and wanting to respond to some of the input we've heard about how do we plug into these big goals. You know, I'm one community college. What am I supposed to be doing vis-a-vis the 550,000 certificates, licenses, credentials that we need to be hitting by 2030? And so feeling like region was the right place to say, let's break these statewide goals down to a regional level, provide some guidance about where we think regions need to be in terms of hitting some of our big goals, but using data and analysis to make those projections, I think, reasonable for the state based on where they're starting. Some regions are starting at 29% attainment. Some regions are starting close to 45% attainment. So if we're going to get to 60 overall, what does that mix need to look like in order to reach the overall?
So you're couching this data in the context of where the schools are having an impact on the data. So Texarkana College, if they're looking at their region, they're not just lost in a sea of data. They're looking at the data that they can have an impact on.
Right. So they'll see their regional specific projections. And something I do just want to note, so some people might be below 60%, but they would be achieving what we kind of anticipate for that region. Mm-hmm. So it might be 55%, but it doesn't mean we want people to stop at 55. If everyone can get to 60, all the better. But this is kind of our best trend analysis to say, people just being, I think, real about that people are starting in different places and wanting to encourage positive growth for everyone, but also living on planet Earth.
In the context of what's right. Achievable.
Right,
yeah,
right.
Yeah. So if you're a faculty member, mm-hmm. How do you use this data? I mean, how do you use it to inform what you do?
Mm-hmm. So, I would go to 60x30TX.com. I would go to the accountability site, and I would just get a sense of where my institution is, maybe related to the statewide average, maybe related to other institutions in my region or others that are kind of in my peer group in terms of size. I would take a look at, excess credit hours has been one of the really kind of hot metrics that people have responded to. And something that I think is really encouraging, and just a plug I wanted to put in, is that we've seen a lot of progress on that measure in the last year. So the average excess semester credit hours last year was 30 for an associate's degree completer, and it dropped to 25 in the most recent year of data, so 2016. So in a year, it dropped 5 on average for the state, which is a really big change. And I might look at, where are we seeing institutions that have had particularly big decreases, and then where's my institution maybe relative to that?
And what's driving the excess credit hour number?
So what I can tell you is that we're seeing a big drop in the 2-year sector. We actually saw no change in the 4-year sector in the last year. So they had previously saw some decreases, but just for kind of that 1-year change. I think we haven't studied it conclusively. So these are just going to be kind of my observations from the field. But what I have heard loud and clear at several different convenings, and some of them formally with the Texas Success Center and the guided pathways work they're doing, is that this is a really animating piece of data. When you think about spending 50% more on a degree, if you're talking about in a student's time or money,
yes, yeah,
that really student debt, et cetera, it really kind of hits people I think to their core to say, if there are things that our system can do better to help people graduate more effectively and efficiently, then we want to do that. And I think that faculty, institutions, and policymakers have responded to that particular measure.
One thing I'm interested in that number, in term, and when I'm asking what drives the number, if the problem is D's and F's, for instance, then the remedy for the excess credits attempted would be maybe gateway courses. Let's focus on those. If it's that they're taking credits that don't apply to the major, that would be that would be more of a counseling and advising thing. So, or if it's drops.
Yeah. I totally see where you're going now. So. This is something that we actually have slotted for the end of this year, by the end of this year, to do some additional analysis on excess semester credit hours, because exactly, if you don't understand the driver, the solution isn't apparent. And so course failures, changing of major, things related to swirl, changing institutions. So, that's something we know now, that when students start and stay at the same institution, this is true in whatever sector, most institutions, then their excess semester credit hours are much lower than if they've been mobile in some way. If they came from a different 2-year, or came from a 4-year back to a 2-year, or 2-year up to a 4-year, when there is mobility, there are more credits lost or more excess credit hours generated. So we know that there are alignment issues there, but how big is that relative to general advising issues within an institution or course failure? So those are some of the things. And the other aspect that I want to take a look at is excess hours by program of study, because I think that we're going to see some programs are going to have fewer and some are going to have more. And nursing is one that comes up a lot. So one that have particular course sequences or a lot of particular course requirements relative to, you can have more electives. Those are going to be probably some of the programs where we see higher levels generated. And again, that tells you where to start your solutions.
Exactly, yeah. I've been very interested lately in conversations I've had with people around program mapping, that it's causing them to ask questions about their program that just had not come up before. And it's very illuminating, because they're seeing that they're losing a lot of students because of things that they just hadn't been looking at. And sometimes just framing the question that way can generate solutions, because they're going to be looking at things and seeing things in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. And often they're seeing things maybe the way the student sees them as being obvious that we're kind of blind to on this side of the table. Right.
Well, I was recently talking to Christine Hubbard at UNT, and she coordinates the North Texas Community College Consortium, and the work they've done, really great work to align kind of AAS to BAS programs. And she talks about how hard she had to work to take a lot of the asterisk superscripts, administrator speak out of these maps that they were trying to design. And it's hard because there is so much nuance and detail to some of the requirements. But when you think about a student looking at this how would they know what any of those things mean? So really, trying to put our student hat on as much as possible in terms of the materials we produce.
So you deal with data all the time. You're swimming around in data just on a daily basis.
That's right, backstroke.
Yeah, I've got a question. How do you deal with the data in relation to anecdotes? Because it seems like people are going to say, well, in my experience, it's this, and they have very valid, often long-term experience, but that's different from data. I guess what I'm wondering is, how do data and anecdote talk to each other? Is there a way for each to correct the other? I mean, sometimes you can look at data and think it's telling you something, but some experience would tell you, well, it's actually probably this other. So it helps you ask the right questions of the data. But anyway, how do you see that intersection?
So the great Uri Treisman says, the plural of anecdote is not data. And I actually wrote that on my whiteboard the very first day I started my new job. And I thought, I have to remember this because especially when you're dealing with humans who are fallible and emotional, stories are critically important. They help us bring life to what the data are telling us and what real human experiences are. So there is a critically important role that stories play in communicating, persuading, understanding. But there is kind of a limit, and I think when you see, the preponderance of evidence, when you're looking at over many years, looking at different subpopulations or taking, triangulating across different studies, I think, I try as much as possible to be guided by what is it that we are seeing or believe to be true to the best of our knowledge. And I do think you're right. Anecdote tells us sometimes to look at the data in a new way, but you absolutely have to have both of these. And in policy, I think that you can get people fired up over, a key piece of data, but you can also make them cry with the right story, and probably both of those are necessary.
I think I read somewhere that 80% of Americans think they're middle class, that we all think we're normal.
Right.
And our experience is the norm and can inform everything we need to know.
Well, and education, I think, is sometimes this bothers me, but education in particular, I think everyone feels their personal experience. I wouldn't say that everyone has their story about other policy domains, whether it's environmental policy or healthcare policy, and maybe you've had some experiences with those, but universally everyone's had some experience with education typically in the United States. So there is, I think, a tendency in this domain more than others to say, well, this is what happened to my daughter, this is what happened to me, and at times losing the forest for the trees if there is, sometimes we focus on the exception.
So the stories are very helpful, but the data tells you whether they're representative anecdotes. Yeah. So what do you wish people knew? I mean, with all the data that you're collecting and the perspective you have, what is it you wish everybody in Texas knew that the data is telling you?
Interesting. So we are starting to do more of this regional analysis, and that's something that I think the coordinating board has actually done for a long time, but I don't know that it got much, saw the light of day very much. So I think the regional work is really important because what you see is that there are really important differences and strengths in almost every region of the state. So one region, let's say Upper Rio Grande Valley, does an exceptional job of moving students from from high school into higher ed. And they may not be the best in terms of overall getting students to ultimate completion, but somewhere along the pipeline, each region has a particular strength. And so I think if we were able to better harness that and say, in an area where you have very low kind of high school to higher ed matriculation, we need to connect you over here with Upper Rio Grande Valley to talk about some of the lessons learned over here, and vice versa, getting people to transfer successfully. We see different regions that are really good at that. So I think there is some network and building on regional strengths that I think is kind of an untapped asset that we have, or just hasn't been deployed in an intentional way, I'll put it that way. The other thing that I'm thinking about right now is I mentioned that the high school to higher education rate is actually dropping in the state. And when we looked more closely at that, what we see is that actually enrollments in public 2 years, public 4 years, ICUT schools, they're all increasing. So I think if you're in an institution of higher education, you think, we're doing a great job. Our enrollments are going up and more students are coming in. We must be serving the population of Texas better. But the number of high school graduates is growing so much faster than we're pulling them into higher education. So it just reframes the way we see the data, right? So it's not as negative maybe as we thought. It's not that fewer people are coming in, more people are coming in. We just haven't served the full population that's coming out. And so those are some of the things that I would highlight to say, the cross-sector work is really important to focus on this growing high school grad population and how are we going to serve them and as effectively as we can in higher education.
One of the data points I see repeatedly is the percentage of students who are female compared to male,
Yes.
and that is real. There's a huge imbalance there.
Yeah.
How much of that is due to males not participating in higher education, and how much of it is females engaging more? There's been a rapid increase in the number of females.
So we are just about to put a 2-pager out on this. So hopefully maybe by the time this is out, we'll be able to share that or send people to it. But
we'll put the link
Okay.
in this. Yeah.
Great. So this is an area where we're just starting some of a deeper exploration. And it really appears that females have been on a positive growth trajectory and males have either been stable or fewer coming in. So I think it's a combination of both. Mm-hmm. What's interesting is that when you look and you track people kind of from 8th grade through college completion, that there are actually more males numerically in 8th grade and in high school, but around 12th grade, you'll see it flip where females start to have not only higher kind of percent, but higher numbers across the state of Texas, where they are moving through the education pipeline at higher rates. And one of the interesting things that came out of our K-12 data fellows group that came together is some folks were saying, well, we kind of knew that we were having a hard time recruiting males to our early college high school, or we saw that it was a little bit harder to get males into some of our AP courses, or and they really started to say, when we build all these things up, we're actually seeing that males are falling behind early in kind of middle school, high school, and then throughout. Mm-hmm. So the time has come for kind of a broad conversation on male achievement. But one thing that we're seeing that's very interesting is when we look at males tend to be clustered in particular majors, and likewise as do females, but in a lot of kind of high return fields. So computer science, engineering, even some certifications that tend to be high return. Males are concentrated there, and some new research from the Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce is saying that men may be more kind of price sensitive or cost sensitive to the cost benefit of the return of higher education, in a way that females are less so. And so where they are coming in, they're coming in to particular programs. And
so when they do choose to go to college, that seems to be a driver.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have a sense yet of why there is this imbalance?
So beyond, I think we're trying to crack that nut live.
Okay.
So I think this analysis, by looking at program study, is one hunch that we have, that there is something going on about economic opportunity. What's your opportunity cost? Like, are there more jobs for males? Employment rates are very low, so more jobs that males can go directly into after higher education, or they can get a workforce certification and go right in. Mm-hmm. Is it not kind of the delayed investment of right out of high school? There are other opportunities I can do instead of paying $30,000 or $10,000 and waiting 2 to 3 years to get back in the workforce. So, and why that has changed over time, I don't dare guess, but that's where our inquiry is right now, is trying to look at some of the national studies and then see if we're seeing some of those patterns reflected in Texas.
What about some of these other subgroups as we're looking at ethnic diversity in the state? That we're seeing enormous differences in completion rates. Do we have a sense of what's driving those numbers?
I would say that when you look at African American males and Hispanic males, there's a history of lower levels of completion, and part of the story is that they're going up a little bit over time. They're just not going up enough. Mm-hmm. So I think it's frustrating to see sort of the persistence of those gaps, despite quite a bit of effort and attention to African American and Hispanic male completion. And I think I don't know that we've solved it, and I think if we had solved it, we would see better outcomes for those students. But it's the work we must do.
Sure. So I've been asking people in these conversations about books that they're reading, things that seem particularly interesting, informative, helpful, either in the work they're doing or just everybody ought to read this novel that they've read. What are some books that you've seen that you'd like our folks to know about?
The first one is Influencer, which is a book that was recommended to me by Bill Holda, and he was
President
fabulous,
Kilgore.
Longtime
Yes.
president at Kilgore College, and basically talks about how do you create kind of the motivation and ability to make change. And I have gone back to it maybe 2 or 3 times when I've been stuck on how do I move something forward, to think about what motivates people and what are the key abilities that you would need to have in order to make this change happen. And it talks about both from kind of an individual level and then a social level. How do you build positive peer pressure? How do you basically influence and move people forward to kind of a common goal? So
terrific, and that works well in teams as well as
it does.
Yeah,
it does.
So Influencer. Good book. Yeah.
Yes, first one. The next one I just read. I just finished it this weekend while I was hunkered down with the rainy Hurricane Harvey.
Yes, yes, we're recording this
Austin.
just as the skies have cleared.
Yes,
so,
yeah. So, The Righteous Mind, and this is a book from a faculty member at UVA, and I've been grappling with the polarization of the U.S. and politically in particular, and so this book talks about how people kind of make decisions, moral decisions, and then the implications for politics, and talks a little bit about that. Basically, we make judgments that we're passionate about first, and then we come up with justifications after. And so how that might play out, I can see that in politics broadly, but also in higher ed policy. How do we have productive conversations when we feel very divided, that we have very different perspectives? And
being able to critique your own point of view and not get caught up in the rationalization you've given for yourself.
Exactly. So how do as someone who tries to convince people with rational argument, that may not always be the right the right approach, to your point about anecdote and otherwise, that really we're kind of emotional beings, and so intuition drives us maybe first, and then we marry that with some rational argument second. Okay. So the other, I'm gonna sneak them all in, Richard.
You'll have a bonus.
Yes.
Okay.
Bonus one. So just quickly, the other one I would say is Lean In. So I hope that's not a cliche for folks out there, but as someone with 2 young kids and kind of balancing work life and home life and how to be a whole person, and is has been useful to me.
It's a terrific book, and there's a lot of insights that I think need to be articulated. If for men especially, to see things that just we're blind to if we don't have it pointed out. But also, I guess, for women to know that they're not the only one that's had that experience. That's part of the experience, and how do we deal with it?
Absolutely, and I've had other women in the workplace kind of ask me how do you do it? How do you balance it? And so I've come back to it on a couple of occasions and shared it with other people, because I think, one of the messages she has is that women leave before they leave, which is either not go for the promotion or, take a little bit less time, and so sometimes they're not considered for the next promotion because they've already sort of pulled themselves back if they're planning to have kids or want to kind of balance family and professional life. So, just kind of encourages you to go for it, even when it's scary and you don't know what the future holds. It's I found it encouraging.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's your 3 books.
Okay, that's my 3 books, and the last 2 are The Checklist Manifesto, Atul Gawande, and then Predictably Irrational, Dan Ariely. Both kind of point to the fallibility of the human brain, and so how do we design systems to build structure around when we need to be systematic, but then also just account for the biases we have as we make decisions. And so I think it's really important from a policy perspective to keep those things in mind.
And Atul Gawande's book is especially good for actually following through and getting things done.
It is.
That's not just having good ideas, but the follow through.
That's right. You need both.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, we will put links to those as well up on the website.
Great.
And Jenna, really appreciate your time. Thanks for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me. It's been fun.
That was Jenna Cullinane Hege. You can find links to many of the resources we discussed on our website at tccta.org/podcast. You've been listening to The Pathfinder. Be sure to join us next week when we speak with Tony Badillo, who directs the dual credit and early college high school programs at El Paso Community College. EPCC was a pioneer in both dual credit and early college high schools, and Tony has been involved since the very beginning. I hope you'll join us for that. If you like this show, tell a friend, subscribe, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, share one of our episodes on social media. You can visit tccta.org to listen to our shows or grab them in your favorite podcatcher or wherever you found this one. The creator of The Pathfinder is me, Richard Moore. Our producers are Carol Hawkins and Gabriel Zambrano. This has been a production of the Texas Success Center and the Texas Community College Teachers Association. We'll catch you next time on The Pathfinder.